Hello everyone, today we talk about the development of Crusader ideology and more specifically the concept, really not new to the religious background of the Middle Ages, not just in Christianity or in monotheism, of war at God's command, right? It's difficult sometimes to distinguish exactly what, began with the First Crusade from a strictly ideological point of view. I mean, there are certain macroscopical characteristics that we will observe today, but we also know that something began here that started being properly described and regulated and further developed, especially over the centuries. As we were saying recently, we were talking about the Third Crusade. Mostly what we know about the Crusades is 13th century literature that is basically, just after the end of the main, the main events of the first century, let's say, the one from the First Crusade to the Battle of Latin and the fall of Jerusalem. And therefore, it's not easy to reconstruct what actually happened back then, but also the same prehistory of the same. And maybe I am relatively biased because I come from a path, at least in which I incurred often in the history of religions, and I was struck, in a sense, to observe how much continuity existed, in a way, with the crusading ideology, between the crusading ideology and the previous religious beliefs since the ancient world and so on. So I will try to explain it in this way. In any case, we've also made other videos about the First Crusade specifically, and a bit what were the roots of it. We have explained the crucial overlooked importance of the Gregorian reform of the papal monarchy. Without that, there would have been crusades as we know them, right? And it's one of those things where there are lots of causes, but even if you take out one, probably surely things would have not gone the way they did, but might have, at the root in some cases as well. So when Urban II launched his appeal for crusade in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, there was, first of all, this aspect was central, fundamentally, the idea that the Church was accepting the participation to a military campaign without sin, right? This also, we could make tons of videos on this single aspect because that had been somewhat fundamental to. We made videos about bloodshed and penitence in early medieval Europe. It was some kind of those universal aspects of it, and the sin was there, but it would have been cancelled fundamentally, but because it was outweighed by the merit of the enterprise. And this the spiritual reward also connected with it was fundamentally motivated by the war cry that we know as Deus vult, God wills it, right? Which we don't know whether the Pope may have coined himself at that point. There is a bit of mythology we don't really know, as we were saying before, but it kind of exemplifies pretty well the idea that this was a God's command itself, right? It was not an expedition like others that had been previously properly characterized from such authority, and how also the renewed papacy after the reform was posing itself towards properly Western Christendom. So there is here a true theology of war, right? So that the Crusaders could directly obey the will of God, right? For example, a work such as the Gesta Dei per Francos is quite eloquent by Guibert of Naucun, that literally means the deeds of God through the Franks. And this logic is exactly what we were hinting at before. I mean, the idea that existed since ancient times, for which mortals' achievements actually passed through the glory of the divine glory that fundamentally descended from the skies and made them achieve victory, right? And this naturally contemplated also a specific merit or valor of the individual, according to certain ethical standards that naturally were the same ones of justice, of order, etc. That also monotheism had, as any religion, practically at the end of the day, and that here, but in a more paradoxically secularized way compared to the one that of ancient times, because Christianity now was starting to regulate this from, at least from a popular perspective, according to such hierarchical authority and specific hierarchy for which nobody else could quite call for such a thing. And this was something very innovative, right? Considering, yes, the schism had already happened between East and West, but fundamentally there was also still a lot of continuity in, religious customs and practices between East and West. And the idea, for example, of a bishop calling for a war and the laity to, obeying to it was something completely unknown to, Byzantine culture for other reasons other than just religious, right, or theological specifically. But so the First Crusade was launched, right, and the idea was literally that God fought on their side. This was not new at all, right? It's difficult even to style specifically crusades as wars of religion, as if what existed before or in parallel or after them weren't wars of religions. Basically, every single people had fought wars exclusively in the name of their deities. Like, there was no way, for example, in the ancient world, to declare war without God's permission. The gods had always wanted that, and therefore the idea that the gods were fighting alongside is, their faithful, but was fundamentally not original, right? It was obvious, and still we're talking about the 11th century, in a moment in which also the divide with paganism, even in Christian society, was not so obvious or evident, right? And not in a contrasting sense, meaning that paganism never had a problem of integrating Christianity in itself as another cult, nor to maintain at the point of full Christianization, even with the elimination of other cults, actually beliefs that were still also functional to these same Christian enterprises. So the First Crusade was the army of God, Exercitus Dei, right? And there was all a narrative also in the story of the First Crusade that is also the most glorious, the victorious one, the one that led to the actual conquest of Jerusalem in one shot, right? It seemed miraculous in many ways, and that strengthened deeply the conviction in the West that, of course, the crusade had been in accordance to God's will, with His blessing specifically. So this, of course, hadn't meant to direct the Christian effort also within the same Christian society, but fundamentally to fight externally, right? And more specifically for the Christian brethren in the East to reconquer their lands from the Muslims, and thus also extending the dominion of Christendom in itself. There was here another idea that dated back since Roman times, and that also the Byzantines believed in that Christianity, that the Church altogether had made its own. That is, that it was fundamentally right to reconquer, and the final aim, in perspective of just war, as we will see in a while, that naturally didn't conceal completely the idea that Christianity had to be triumphant on earth at some point. But that could happen at also the end of times, not necessarily in between, but in the meanwhile. But let's say that reconquering formerly Christian lands was the will of God, and which, Christian lands, the Holy Land by definition. As we have also seen in other videos, the feasibility of the territorial expansion and properly reconquest of Christendom, right? The Norman conquest of Sicily, essentially blessed by the papacy, and there it was fundamentally a crusade, right? The Hauteville took the cross as such on behalf of the papacy itself to. And the kingdom of Sicily, before it was the control on the island, even before it was conquered. Other obvious example was the Reconquista, and there there were instances specifically in which indulgence, the remissio of sins, had already been fundamentally granted for the conquest of specific places. There have been other areas, for example, the reconquest of Sardinia by the Pisans, the Genoese, etc. And there was this broader effort that naturally was partly also the same cause and had provided the necessary confidence for the same crusade. These last successes had been read in an historical perspective by Urban II as a sort of coming back of God's favor towards the Christians, right? The Pope was hinting at, for example, Daniel's prophecy 2:21 says he changed the times and the seasons, he removed kings and set up kings, fundamentally to develop on God's behalf now to seize that opportunity that was Saint God's favor presented to the Christians, right? And the deeds of God to the Christians is a concept that dates back properly to the First Crusade, to the papacy specifically. It wasn't even confined to the expeditions in the East, naturally. And he explained also specifically Urban II, in a letter to the Bishop of Huesca in Spain, wrote, quote, that God, quote, in our days has indeed fought the Turks in Asia, and in Europe the Moors with the might of the Christians, right? So the Christians here were put, let's say, next to God as fundamentally God's helpers, right? So identifying in the Roman Church and in its divisions, let's say, as they were being moved during the Crusade, a properly holy character, right? That was the same one, essentially, of the Holy Ghost, and that somewhat permeated this activity together with the broader, within the broader ecclesiological dimension. As we were saying, there was an historical perspective in which the Christians were felt to have lost in the previous centuries their lands to the Muslims because of their own sins, right? With the First Crusade, instead, in the previous successes we've seen that had anticipated it, fundamentally God would have shown through the conquest of Jerusalem, so much that when in 1187 Jerusalem was lost again, the same rhetoric has come back. It was essentially the Christians' sinfulness that had brought to such loss, right? So there were probably some phases in history which God was, admonishing or praising the Christians for their behavior. And the same crusade, in its nature, was seen naturally as a form of penance and repentance in itself, which would ensure, through itself, the restoration of God's help to the Christian, right? So it was essentially God's grace to be able to participate to the crusade in the first place, and to do it practically, because this was autonomous too. As we will see, this had to do properly of how the indulgence also for the crusade was conceived. And especially in the relation between the faithful and, of course, God and the church as a medium. Again, the proofs of these endeavors had been already seen in Spain, in Sicily, right, and the extension of Christendom in the East as well. And the indulgence was promised, together with the crusading vow, as essentially the main distinguishing mark of the crusade, at least, one of from especially the participants' point of view. The same Urban II had laid down precise conditions for the indulgence. As in all things Christians, it wasn't achieved through the material deeds, right? For example, the warlikeness in itself, but the personal attitude of the Crusader, right? Only those who went to Jerusalem, quote, solely from devotion to God to liberate the church would receive the indulgence. Literally, quicunque pro sola devozione, non pro honoris vel pecunia adeptione, ad liberandam ecclesiam Dei Jerusalem profectus fuerit, iter illud pro omni penitentia ei reputetur, which naturally was aimed at discouraging those who thought just the venial benefit from the crusade itself, but naturally was quite ideal. But it was important to stress for legitimizing the same crusade, right? If you have a real faith and you go for solely from devotion to God for the Holy Land, well, that's what will get you salvation, right? And the intention is important, because you may have died during the expedition without having fought or practically achieved anything in material sense, but of course the intention would have saved because of God's grace, though, and this is naturally complicated. It's all the problem with indulgence. It's not so easy, but it was theologically, but it was however, the church as a medium presented this possibility, right? And so if you had carried out the same exact expedition, but just for material reasons, you would have not been saved. And so the connection between faith and grace there was still justifying the whole thing, if you think about it, still theologically speaking. But according to, for example, traditional definitions, which Eva of Schacht was currently in process of restating, even the same crusade counted as a just war. That is, aside from the indulgence, the holy character of it, there was properly, in terms of political and moral justification, a lot to it. And only the attitude of participants would make this just war into a holy war, right, in which they could earn spiritual advantages. Right, so the two things, the secular and the religious, were thus separated. And the content of the indulgence was just as clearly defined, by the way, because participation in the crusade would count as fulfillment of an ecclesiastical penance for previous misdeeds. Right? In this sense, it was a spiritualization of the same war, through the transformation of the crusade itself in the penance, right? There would be maybe a subtle distinction, that is to say, the crusade in itself was seen as a penance, as a pilgrimage proper, right? So the war is not completely overlappable, right? It's something slightly different, but it is still the effort and the participation in the crusade would eliminate, let's say, the sin, right? So much that if the crusader had died, right, in full devotion, he would have immediately earned his place in the kingdom of heaven. Up to that point, you see, penance had mostly being about the withdrawing from the world, right? This was something somewhat different, because the distancing from the physical world as well, up in previous centuries, had been an important element of this process. This was fundamentally annulled, and just the spiritual dimension, right, within in the believer's conscience was accepted, right? The believer would take upon himself the attendant penance. It was a sort of compensation, a means to salvation, and also self-punishment in itself, right? And this was a way, essentially, for the penitent to show the church that he had turned back to God. Of course, he didn't end there, because he had to fulfill that. But going on the crusade, it was a very, let's say, evident way of proving it in a sense. It was a very, you understand, people sometimes left everything they had. They sometimes they wouldn't probably even come back anymore, for many reasons, not just death. So it was really a great enterprise for them. It wasn't easy. Think even about just communications at the time. It was really felt evidently, even aside from the material opportunities that the crusade in itself presented, but it was still a great choice. And it was a way to offer your own life to please God, right? Because even dying was a quite concrete risk, right? So in a somewhat still contractual view of existing at the time, it was worth it. It was accepted as an adequate work for the greatness of the reward. So there is a spread, starting from the first crusade, of the term remissio peccatorum in the sources, right? So the remission of sins earned by the crusader. And the same Urban II began to use this vocabulary, right? And let's say, one thing was indispensable for having your sins remitted. The penitent acknowledgement of one's guilt through confession, right? If the sinner's change of attitude was perfected, right? He was thus reconciled with God and the church, right? Yet he had to prove this, right? By working for God, going the crusade, right? So it was just a start. It was a mean to say, okay, you're reconciled because you're doing it also in the name of you're doing it in the name of God and the church. So we give you green light for it, but you have to demonstrate. Otherwise, this salvation would have not been achieved, and the same remission of sins would have not taken place proper. Thus, and this was a big deal, because literally people at the time believed that if temporal penalties could be thus annulled, salvation was real, was seen as a great investment. And it is fascinating that this concept was already at the root of the crusading ideology since the First Crusade, albeit the theology of the effect of indulgences would have not precisely established until the 13th century, right? But this was already put on the fore, which witnesses how concretely important was for getting the crusade started and properly participated was at the time. So this it was a sort of transcendental work in the eyes of God to participate the crusade, right? It was since the beginning connected to it, right? And the effect was, as we were saying before, that as soon as the crusader died, he could pass directly into eternal life, right? The martyrs of the early church. So you understand also the concept of passion, of sufferance, of penance, how strong it was. This was essentially an emulation of Jesus in itself. And of course, there was the integration of other traditional ideals, such as the chivalric and / warlike way of life, into the struggle to save one's soul. This also had belonged traditionally to the world society since millennia, right? And before, and it's also when what was chivalry, right? Because already a comitatus leader of the migration era had actually some of the most intense connections with these ideas, and possibly lived them even more concretely in a broader political and social sense, even without the church, but still believing fundamentally that the divinity had, could give this reward in afterlife, and it had always been there, right? In Christian terms, the best way to save one's soul was entering a monastery, right? It's being the surest way, in a sense. But it was, kind of obvious at this point that given the broader moral and material revival and availability of resources in Europe, that there would have been so many other ways fundamentally to perform one's duty in that sense. For example, Guibert of Nogent says that God had specifically created new means of salvation, and these were the Praelia Sacra. They were literally the holy battles, right? A mean of salvation for a warrior of previous centuries would have been properly to fight for its own beliefs, because war had never been dissociated from the broader role of that the warriors and their leaders of the world had in properly keeping the Christian or pre-Christian world together, right? So it's as if Christianity now was simply extending where a certain type of tradition had always existed, right? And not surprisingly so, exactly with the Gregorian reform, to stress the universality and the complete permeation, right, of society from the side of the Church of Rome. So that such behaviors that were traditionally sinful, right, like killing, were now not killing itself, but as you understand, fighting, and there was no hypocrisy there. Everybody knew what war was about, and has always been about. So this was a way simply to give new sanction to the fact that the say holders of the order, right, of the world order, could receive properly a full sacralization of their endeavors, of their efforts, if they were, as we've seen, truly devoted to Christian values of the absolute, that do tend to the absolute, and that these crusaders wouldn't even, theologically properly understand, but that would accept in a view of the world that after all wasn't so at all different from the one of Christianity itself. Here we should give, I know, a deeply explained background of what I'm talking about properly in the development of the history of religions, but it's just a modernistic misconception to presume that monotheism is somewhat incompatible with the core values of what fundamentally human experience is in any other situation. There is no such thing like an opposition really between the pagan world and its ideas to what eventually monotheism came up with. It's not the new thing that nobody had ever heard, different values, different morals. This is just a deeply modernistic and secularistic, and sometimes also kind of definitely extremistic view of religious developments. It was anything of that kind. It would have been so strange for somebody here to be Christian, to have still fundamentally to completely overlap with a pagan moral system. But again, we shall make more of it. There is some explanation of this in the Medieval Knighthood series that deals with this extremely gradual, imperceptible transition in every these times specifics. But let's say that the most important change in the view of the crusading ideology is that it was not necessary anymore to turn a monk and leave this world in order to save your soul more easily. The order of knights, such as the Ordo Equestris in itself, and the common people, even the vulgus, could win God's grace by performing their allotted tasks, right? As the saying said, ex suo ipsorum officio. This is particularly important because you understand that it's not even about war, technically. It's not even about the military side of the story. The art of Equestris was the military one, par excellence. The Vulgus were just the commoners, right? They were basically the undefended people that could simply join the crusade and still receive the same favors, right? So that's why it's important to stress the concept of pilgrimage, because that's literally what it was about. It wasn't much about the war in itself. There were further developments. For example, after the failure in this ideology, after the failure of the Second Crusade, the shame of Damascus, Otto of Freising, writing his chronicle of the First Crusade, continued to use some of these categories. For example, because his view, from a German perspective, was the one of a world that had turned upside down. You see, in his own times as much as during the First Crusade, and that for this reason, providentially, a new kind of soldiery had arisen. The Novum Militiae Genus, specifically. Why? Because this would have fundamentally to fix the world. He wrote, quote, that the new knights arisen seemed, quote, from their behavior and way of life to be monks rather than soldiers because of their devotion. He was referring in this case specifically to the Templars, the oldest of the monastic military orders, and for whom Bernard of Clairvaux himself had coined the expression of Nova Militia, famously enough. So the idea of renewal, of redemption, right, of a new age, fitted in this case Otto's story, as fundamentally he noticed how before the time of First Crusade, the struggle between father and son in Christendom, and also embodied properly by the one between Henry the Fourth and Henry V, Holy Roman Emperors, had fundamentally disordered the world, right? So in this providential vision, the new knights, according to Otto, had banded together in the order of the Templars in the Holy Land, basically dissociating themselves from a civil war in the empire, so that the secular element was fundamentally escaped completely, right? They were by themselves a new sign that the ideal of the heavenly Jerusalem was drawing near, right? This went in parallel with contemporary ecclesiastical reform, so this shows the wickedness of the secular world in a sense. It's as if these knights, the Templars themselves, that were properly monastic orders, had represented the possibility of somebody who wanted to practice a different lifestyle, such as the one of the properly at contact with the world, such as the knights did, right? But were fundamentally out of the secular disorder. This is quite important because it's the same concept that lays within the monastery. The monastery has to be retired from the world, not disconnected with it, as a reflection of the Civitas Dei itself, of heavenly Jerusalem, to show an example. Ideally, in the monastic ideal, the whole world should have become a monastery, right? So, it's very fascinating from a 12th century perspective. That world, through the Crusade, had begun, at least here Otto is talking about 1 century before, but that had begun to extend and to replicate heavenly perfection through such example in every branch of society. Because, and here it's interesting that it's not, in fact, the military one is not eliminated in this regard. And the Crusade thus offered lay people their own way to salvation, right? Those who had, those knights that had instead kept fighting in the quarrel between Henry IV, Henry V, had forgotten their primary duty to God and intertwining this kind of unnatural, right, son against father etc. Had some. So what lost the plot in a Christian perspective? These other men were showing essentially what was instead there would have been the right thing to do, right? It's as if, yes, it was taking vows. There was probably a vow to be taken, as we've seen, to participate in the crusade. So the monastic experience was very close to it, if not overlapping. In the mid-12th century, Gero of Reichersberg reduced this view in a general formula. So that is fascinating, because he basically said that on the basis of the Holy Scripture, every person can find its own way of salvation, right? Therefore, it was not necessary to be just a monk to do it, to renounce the world properly. But there was an addition in his theory that said that, ideally Christians renounce already once, and in theory, ideally it's at least for all to the world when they abjure the devil at baptism, at their own baptism. So it's somewhat a sort of natural state of man within the church to already belong to a world that as in the Bible it said, give back to Caesar what is of Caesar. Not meaning that you don't have to live in the world of Caesar itself, but that fundamentally what is important is more your own moral inner dimension, and by responding to that, you respond to God's will, right? To listening to your own conscience. And this is also a beautiful interpretation that everybody can essentially find their own way through the Scripture, right? This was applied as well to knights who went to the crusade, but also those who wouldn't go in the crusade, and however would still fulfill the military duties in their own country. And here, in fact, there was, as we will see, a connection with other aspects of medieval, even lay policy, because of course also the laity had, in this regard, a capacity to discern between good and evil, right? And having a conscience that could guide them in this sense, and still making, obeying to God's will for everybody's benefit, without even going to a crusade and taking a vow. But still, this vow always existed in one or another in that society, because if anything, in order to be a Christian, you had to. So it was just a reflection into the secular world that you had to demonstrate, though, with action. So in perspective, it was the connection with indulgence that made war in itself, right? And it was thus the same crusade, the same Christian response to the Muslim conquest of the Holy Land, to represent a sign of God's grace by itself. Because if Christians had not done it, it would mean that kind of holy enterprise would have not been rendered available by God itself, right? Always remember, it's God that makes this, truly. Mortals just, have the choice whether to respond to the call or not, but still it's God's grace that, saves without, possibility of aside from works in itself. And there is always this asymptotic, borderline where the humanity by itself cannot understand, but through faith. So God had made the crusade into a means of salvation for a sinful man proper. And this is stressed by many authors, such as also Bernard of Clairvaux himself. However, when in 1187 Jerusalem was lost, Pope Gregory VIII made a crusading appeal, famously known as Audita Tremendi, that would start fundamentally the Third Crusade, that was explicitly saying that God had, because it's God's will in a way or another, had Jerusalem fall, by putting the Christians to test to see if whether they were prepared to do penance and risk their lives for their brethren, because definitely it was the Christians' fault because of their sins if Jerusalem had fallen. Right? There was no other alternative. Now, God wanted to test again what the response would have been. Things went further even at the end of the at that point, at the beginning, at the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, where the main games were over in the Near East, just some avamposts held. But let's say that Innocent III, that represent the single most powerful pope, right? The Roman Church was never as powerful and dominating and hegemonic as under Innocent III, that also sent a crusade against the heretics within the same Europe, right? That the crusade in itself he went so far as saying the crusade was God's demand for the service which was owing to him, right? So, and that anyone who would refuse it would earn damnation, actually, the day of judgment. So it was at that point, and that tells you that the power of the papacy and its view and its demand, properly in Christian society, that whoever would have not participated in the crusade would have been damned, right? So it was not just an opportunity, it was properly a duty, and whoever would not respond would have been punished. Naturally, this also reflects the state of the crusade in the Near East itself, that is, at that point, how to recover Jerusalem. Basically, most of the possibility had been lost on the short run. So this absolutistic attitude was also, you have to go to the crusade, even if you don't want to, even if you don't see it feasible or convenient at this point. And it's very meaningful that such idea came out at that point, in fact. The properly following Christ was still the way in all this. The main problem was following Christ literally in the measure in which the Holy Land was seen as Christ's heritage. So every moment that would pass with the holy places in the infidels' hands was an offense towards Christ that the same Christians indirectly made, right? So this was the kind of emotional blackmail, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it, as it was a primary duty of Christendom to recover the old. It was more than, the world was changing indeed, but still by the early 13th century it was a big deal to think that the world could be had to be recompacted under an ecumenic rule, and with the this universalistic pillars, such as properly the control of the holy places and the existence of an empire, of a papacy, etc. As we were saying before, this idea that the infidels had offended God, and that in this totalizing manner, so at the point that the world had gone wrong since Christ's crucifixion and all what followed eventually in a broader sense as the destiny of the world, was seen also as a form, as a justification for retaliating against basically any enemy of the church. In fact, sadly enough, as we know, with the Crusades began also the persecutions against the Jews that were already legally discriminated, but during early medieval times surely had suffered less violence. Instead, with the Crusades, there was, especially in certain countries, probably a true revival of sheer violence that is motivated by reasons that are not just properly religious. I mean, easily enough, people just wanted to steal the Jews' possessions at that point. And as we've seen, actually, the Christian lay and secular authority always protected the Jews, and very, very firmly, and defended them, especially from violence, by using other violence on the Christians that wanted to harm them, because definitely that's not a civilized thing to do. Not just because in that perspective the Christians were to actually preserve the Jews in the function of being the only non-Christian people to witness the come of Christ, and therefore saying, we were right, but let's say that they obviously had a positive role in society that, as you know, especially in these centuries, helped dramatically also in the process of urbanization, of trade. The Jewry was quite monarchic friendly, especially, and that's also why the elites were actually supportive of them. Who would attack them was just scum of society, and as such, of course, they could be massacred. So, unfortunately, however, this wouldn't spare the Jews from instead, getting actually persecuted and killed themselves. There are some disturbing episodes in all this. And some of the most important Christian theologians at the time were, in fact, warning and appealing to the faithful not to direct violence towards the right direction, right, into these military, orderly military expeditions, controlled, commanded by the authority and so on. The same Bernard of Clairvaux was a staunch defender of the Jewry, and there was, the Jews had behaved peaceably. There was no need to persecute them. That could be seen as justifiable at the time. And Bernard of Clairvaux arguments were theological, right, properly. The Bible said that the Jews would be converted before the Last Judgment, right? So until to that point, they would have had to atone for their crimes and by their miserable lives, right? And they must witness to biblical truths, right? So they couldn't be taken out, as we were saying before. To our modern sensitivity, this sounds kind of weird, but still, for the time, this actually preserved, as you know, these communities from actual extermination. Obviously, these considerations were not enough to spare, to curb such violence, but it's still important to stress how the papacy itself, right, the monarchy, the bishops, were extremely protective towards the Jewry, and were the first ones that, in all the crusading business, were saying, do not touch them, right? This is quite important because people get such broader things sometimes, as if, the 11th century wasn't definitely the 21st, but still there is much more to learn sometimes from the past, where there were no things like human rights or properly our civil order and understanding of reality, etc., to see how even empirically certain sensible ideas were somewhat more spread than today's sometimes, where by the 21st century, just the fact of still having anti-Semitism is frankly basically one of the indicators of the level of moral inferiority of a society, right? And if people just studied their past, they would know that even their own religion said something very different, and that certain attitudes are just a result of actual moral and material inferiority, discrimination, stupidity, lack of education, and nothing else, right? And there is just an enormous sense of shame, of inferiority, and self-worthlessness in being an anti-Semite, right? And this should be sculpted in everybody's minds. There is, when talking about crusades, there is no way around, however, the fact that these were still wars, essentially. So, as we've seen, they could be conceived as armed pilgrimages or deeper spiritual journeys. I mean, there is also beautiful literature, even poetry, the view of what this experience was. You cannot reduce the crusade to war. It's silly. But still, it had to do with it. So there was also an important problem of just justifying the crusade itself. You see, the crusades were also different. The first one was truly the first comprehensive war against the heathen, right? So that specifically had required some sort of special religious justification, which is exactly what we are discussing today. Eventually, the idea gained ground. It expanded, as we've seen in the following centuries and so on. But once that Jerusalem was conquered, the kingdom established and its surrounding outer states, more or less depending on it, had been created, there was at that point properly a Christian domain that as such was felt as, okay, those are Christian lands now. There were also lots of Christians, by the way. It weren't just Muslims or Jews or sometimes even other groups. Definitely there were different churches, different confessions, so on. So that even, the Eastern Christians weren't actually seen very differently from Muslims in the Western Christians' eyes, in a sense, nor necessarily there was the same amount of sympathy from both sides for that reason, but not because of strictly religious reasons only, but for many others. Just the fact that this was essentially a foreign invasion, there was some difference. We were discussing it the other day, but it's famously enough the sack of Jerusalem. Christians were exterminated by saying Christians. At that point, it's not to justify that, but we must say that if a city exists in those times, it's because the citizenry participates to the defense. So by the habitual rules of war at the time, everybody would have been exterminated independently from their religious action, right? And that was wholly normal everywhere, both in the Christian and the Muslim world, but also in any other, even pagan world, etc. And it's just an evidence of a rule of war, right? There is no such thing like a guy that keeps the walls and gate and all the poor citizens inside have nothing to do. If a city exists, it's because they are in block resisting against the. Of course, there are different factions, but there's no way in pre-industrial times to coerce such an amount of people with that amount of power. They were participating against them. But let's say that once these states were established, there was at least the moral justification for a just war in the defensive nature of the same, right? Bernard of Clairvaux expressly points this out also in his crusading epistle, that explicitly states that force must be repelled by force, by referring to the renewed aggression that the heathen were waging on the Crusader states, and that therefore had to be responded at that point with violence itself. There is hardly any reference of juristic justification to occur for the Crusades, right? There is mostly a different form of propaganda that has to do mostly with the topical descriptions of Muslim atrocities, the laments for the lost heirs of the Holy Land. Most people in Europe wouldn't even know what it was there like, right? This is evidenced by the same crusading sources, etc. The Crusaders who lived in the Near East had a completely different worldview from the one of the Westerners that came there just for the first time. And incidentally, and obviously, they were much more tolerant and pragmatic and somewhat also probably more intelligent, given the constant pressure under which they were, than very often also the fanatics that came from the West, because that's a normal process. It's like you find it in Islam as well, right? The newly converted, the ones who were in for the first time, the new thing, were always the more zealot. The Seljuk Turks had been the case before when they had conquered Jerusalem, so it was a bit the same dynamic, but then you have to make things work, and definitely that can hold with fanatism, which is just idiotic in strategic education. But there was this constant appeal for help and call for punishment and revenge. That was a way, in fact, exactly to stimulate that reaction, because many people, many people had been at this point in the Near East. They had seen what it was like, and a knight who would leave his castle and lands for for years, well, obviously had to go there for some good, by risking his own life for some good reason. Mostly this idea of salvation, yes, but together with some other advantages that were material, that were also a matter of connection, of duties, etc. As we will see, the lay authorities also essentially gained prestige from organizing crusades themselves, and it was a way also there to respond simply your king's call, etc. But the main problem was properly to send people there. The main problem of the Ottoman states was shortage in manpower, because nobody would stay for a long time there. They would come, they would make their pilgrimage to the holy places, they would maybe go in some minor clash, and then they would go back to Europe after a few weeks or a few months, right? And therefore, there was a constant need to call people from away, and the fact that eventually that response never arrived in a satisfactory fashion, so that eventually the Crusader states were lost on the long run. Not even such a long one, by the way. It's just 1 century effectively that they existed as real concrete territorial entities. Speaks for the lack of interest, after all. So the propaganda, of course, was similar as in other times of history, to say, okay, look at what these bastards are doing there, just come here and let's pound them. But the truth was very different, and somewhat disappointing, at least for those who would imagine, who knows what would happen. But at least salvation was that extreme answerance in a way or another. And the crusade also served importantly to legitimize, to justify certain actions in the same Europe. That is to say, especially by counterposing the crusade in its justice, let's say, to the local disputes, right? To the internal disputes among the barons and the warlikeness of the military class that was quite troublesome, and that hopefully would be channeled in that sense in the crusading efforts. That was definitely a more suitable field, and surely crusades were also about this. And because it was normal, as you know, for cadet sons to go around as martyrs fundamentally, and just to keep killing each other for the best offer, and all the competition and all the destructive consequences of the case locally that were felt from a structural way. There was no such thing like a just war at home, right? Let's say that were some ways of essentially the wars would go on anyway, right? And there were naturally certain process of justification, but just wars there were much more difficult practically to define, right? To regulate, and especially because they were not properly organized on a universal scale like the crusade instead fundamentally was. So at least the crusades began to propagate the belief that there were different degrees of legitimacy in warfare, right? So much that only the superior authorities, such as the monarchs, could fundamentally wage such a thing like a just war. This went in parallel with properly making the barons, feudal right to make war morally unacceptable, right? The 12th century, as you know, is the great moment of construction of the feudal monarchies, where kings really rise to a superior level compared to previous centuries, where they were fundamentally just some of the most powerful and like the formally recognized monarchs, but equally to the other nobility in a sense. There is properly a definition of social order that often goes actually along with war itself, right? For the need properly of pacifying the territories, for having a joint effort to, in this sense, seeing the community the community need of stability as more important to the individual the divisions and causes, let's say. It was understood that naturally political cohesion made a greater military force. So this is a civilizational process that evolves gradually and that had emerged from the same baronial warfare at the end of the day. Things were compacting ever since the disgregation of public power since Carolingian times, properly through all these local wars from which eventually larger and larger lordships would emerge, managing to catalyze this broader compacting process, right? And Guibert of Nogent once again presents a historical view of how the process had happened. In antiquity, he says, wars had been characterized by a lust for domination. But still, like in Roman times, in Christian times, there had been wars that were justified in the name of the freedom of the res publica, right? Especially against heathen enemies. And this appeared as a quite, good parallel to what monarchs were trying to do in their lands at the time as well, right? So, together with the wars aimed at protecting the church that were justified, also the ones to protect the welfare, the well-being of the state were also acceptable along similar lines. And there is, in fact, also there has to be a just war in the first place, like a concept of just war in the first place, if you want to justify anything, even the same crusade, right? Because Wood decides that a war is just, there is no properly an authority that makes it, right? It is a matter of agreement. That's why before we were saying that the papal monarchy was so important, because a fragmented church would have concretely not managed to organize on such a large scale a thing like the Crusade, right? So the Crusade itself was basically a just war like all others that had, however, acquired also the status of a holy war, right, in a more elevated sense, but still it was part of the just wars. So equally, the king's wars now were increasingly seen as morally uncondemnable, right? Therefore, the idea was that as long as they transcended self-interest, such as we've seen in the case of the Crusader, that does it just for salvation, not because of personal gains on earth, and the same for kings that would fight for the well-being of the republic, let's say, well, these could be accepted. Wars like the baronial ones that maybe had similar reasons but were simply the weaker side of the story, and that still inflated division and therefore put in danger indeed the broader community, were seen as less justifiable. And it was a correct idea also in Clausewitzian terms. So as we've seen, to assist the Orthodox Christians in reconquering Jerusalem had been the objective of the First Crusade, right? What happened in the Near East during the 12th century was fundamentally the mold through which ideologically all the other crusades would have been styled on, right? And also because of the obvious fact that still after the fall of Jerusalem, Christians would have always were in intention to retake Jerusalem at some point, right, just by default. So any other kind of crusade was somewhat connected ideally to that. The crusading indulgence, which characterized this form of holy war, depended on a willingness to enter into the service of God, right? So the mentality of the crusader here was crucial, right? Not even properly the political aim of the war. That was transcended because it's secular in nature. It existed, but it went beyond. The most important thing was the inner motivation. So this inner motivation could easily make transposing the crusading indulgence to other fields, right, of action, right? Ideally, everything, right, every aspect of Christian life, and depending naturally on the intensity of the struggle, that, as we've seen in the case of the Crusade, was a very high thing, and in fact, Crusaders coming back had a huge prestige because they were felt as if they had acquired some kind of higher sacral virtue in the process, as being crowned by God in that sense because of their service. And so this all these ideas did not somewhat wore out the crusading ideal, right? They are essentially the crusading ideal itself, right? That the spiritual advantages could be won from a war on behalf of the church, right? And naturally this reflects the preeminence the church had acquired in the West as a broader authority, right? A central one after centuries of theoretical split, right? The Roman Church was not just the prima inter pares, but fundamentally now the head of Western Christianity, properly from a hierarchical and monarchical point of view. And this was exactly the nature of command, right? Command of God through the church to fight in a crusade. All right, for now we stop in here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.